Salam alaikum. My name is Beatriz Valencia. I'm the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs Liaison at the City of Albuquerque. I want to invite you to watch the webinar called Understanding and Preventing Islamophobia Through Education and Dialogue. This is part of the Unite Against Hate Week. Discover the history and current manifestations of these prejudices which occur globally, nationally, locally, and in college campuses. Explore possible solutions. Okay, today's agenda is Welcome and Introductions. Message from Mayor Timothy Keller and U.S. Attorney Alexander Ubayes. Understanding and addressing Islamophobia, implications for preventing hate crimes and religious-based bullying of Muslim youth by a researcher, Marwa Abdallah.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm Mayor Tim Keller. In our city, we understand that building a safe, more equitable future starts by working together. We know that words matter and that hateful speech can lay the groundwork for conflict, crimes, and human rights violations. We understand that being united does not mean being all the same. We can have differing views, still show respect to our neighbors. Diversity makes us better, and Albuquerque is proof of that. Today, I encourage you to listen to each other, to be intentional with your language, and to use it to bring peace, not harm. This is a time to celebrate our differences, knowing that we have much more in common than what separates us. Enjoy the webinar.
Recent events have drawn division into the center of our conversation. And I'm here this evening because to survive, we need to unite against what divides us. I'm Alex Ubayes. I'm the United States Attorney here in the District of New Mexico, and the vocabulary of division permeates the discourse of my profession. Law-abiding versus criminal, punishment versus forgiveness, innocent versus guilty. In this word versus, each of us is called to a fight against a criminal, against a cop, against a lawmaker, against a judge who imposed a lenient sentence, a prosecutor argued for a harsh one, or a defense attorney who helped his client walk free. Opposition feels righteous. It's easy to frame our demands in the negative, stop this or an end that. But these slogans just tell us the responsibility lies in another, and worse, they tell us that our job is done once we've held that other to account. But opposition only feels righteous. Holding to account teaches us to give up on our shared humanity, to fight hate with hate. The King teaches us that darkness cannot drive out darkness. On May 31st of 2013, we lost beautiful 8-year-old Sunny Ray Reza. Sunny died because two groups of adult men, strangers, decided that they couldn't live in peace. A beef over words, a dispute that had nothing to do with her. A death that was avoidable. I know this because after 8 days in trial on October 8th of 2015, I convicted David Candelaria for Sunny's murder. At the time, I was in the Crimes Against Children unit at the DA's office. At the age of 29, this is 4 years out of law school, this is already my third life conviction for the murder of a child. I say this in sadness, because not 2 weeks later, on October 20th, we took the call for Lily Garcia. Lily died because two adult men, strangers, decided that they couldn't live in peace. A beef over driving, a dispute that had nothing to do with her, a death that was avoidable. And a year ago, we lost a beautiful 11-year-old boy, and he died because two groups of men decided that they could not live in peace. A beef over words, a dispute that had nothing to do with him, and another death that was avoidable. We can blame the men, we can blame the guns, but convicting David Candelaria did not save Lily Garcia. To save our kids, you have to take a long, hard look in the mirror and realize that these children died because men chose opposition. They chose to hold someone to account. These children died because men saw strangers where they should have seen brothers. This approach of holding to account has failed. We can't continue to claim credit for effort alone. It's time to liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which cannot bear the weight of reality. So here's the secret. The versus is an illusion. There is no us, there is no them, there is only we. And we are a single community that has to figure out how we live together in peace. I visited Lily's grave earlier this year. Her picture's on it. She is beautiful. Lily and Sunny with the long brown hair, beautiful brown eyes, and smiles that light up a room. Lily and Sunny look like my daughters. They could have been my daughters. Could have been your daughters. Lily and Sunny are our daughters. I have 2 daughters and a son, and if you've seen me, you've seen my son. That kid is my twin. And I feel terrible about that. Because of federal criminal defendants, 80% are male, 50% are Latino, and the average age is 38, which means that I am the average federal criminal defendant. I'm the only average federal criminal defendant serving as United States Attorney. Out of 94 of us, there's only 3 other Latinos, and if you're wondering, I'm the youngest. But I'm only 2 years younger than Tony Torres, and right now, not too much younger than David Candelaria when he killed Sonny. Brown hair, brown eyes, light complexion. David and Tony look like me. They look like the man my son will grow up to be. My son could grow up to be them. Your sons could grow up to be them. They are our sons. Our sons killing our daughters. At times, the despair is overwhelming. Don't fall into despair, because we need you. We need each other to survive. Each of us has a responsibility to stand up for others, not through thoughts and prayers, not through sympathy, but through actively seeking peace. To see no strangers, as Valley Core tells us. To stop fighting our present, to start building the future that we deserve, because while there are 2 sides to every argument, not every argument's justified, which means both sides can be wrong. We're not bound by our past, and the future does not belong to us. It belongs to our children and to their children. And so when I say do not fall into despair, what I mean is that we have a responsibility to rise above despair. Sympathy is an easier emotion to access than hope. We can't settle for what is easy. You're here because you care. You're here because you know that we share a responsibility for our future. We owe this world hope and optimism. We owe each other the hard work of love. We need to abandon binary consensus building. We need to rise together as a community. We need to see no strangers. Never miss an opportunity to demonstrate who we can be. That's why you're here today. Be safe, be brave. We do this together.
Thank you all for being here today. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. My talk today is entitled Understanding and Addressing Islamophobia and Implications for Preventing Hate Crimes and Religious-Based Bullying of Muslim Youth. And our outline today is really just to talk for a minute about why we're here, why this panel, why this topic, and then look a little bit at who are American Muslims. We'll follow that by talking about Islamophobia itself and why we witness so much of it. We'll conclude, I think most importantly, by talking about how we can address it. And I believe questions will be later on in the panel. We are here today because 55% of Muslim students in our K-12 school system have reported that they have been bullied because of their religion. 55% is over twice the national average. And as many of you know, bullying can lead to feelings of isolation, rejection, exclusion, and despair, and can also contribute to potential depression and anxiety. As a parent myself, what is most concerning about this statistic is that 1 in 4 of these incidents involves a school teacher, school administrator, or staff. And just to give some contextualization, this is all happening against the backdrop of political discourse that demonizes Muslims and a rise in anti-Muslim hostility. Between 2016 and 2017, there was a 91% increase in hate crimes against Muslims. And many of us would realize that this paralleled the amplification of anti-Muslim bigotry in political discourse. These next few slides actually have quotes from students who have experienced bullying, and I planned on reading those quotes, but I think even more salient than reading these quotes that have been amassed in the past few years is the idea that Jewish and Muslim groups in this very moment are reporting spikes in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes, many of which are undoubtedly fueled by bigotry, negative stereotypes, and misinformation. Yesterday was the funeral of Wadia Al-Fayoum, a 6-year-old Palestinian American boy who was stabbed in his home 26 times on Saturday by his family's landlord just outside Chicago. The Department of Justice is investigating this as a hate crime. The man entered the home, began choking the boy's mother, Hanan Shaheen, and stabbing her and saying, "All Muslims," or "You Muslims must die." As we grieve and mourn these incidents of hate crimes in the United States, we also grieve and mourn the devastation and loss of innocent lives in the Middle East. I know that many of you are following the news and know that as of this morning, at least 1,400 people in Israel have been killed, and over 3,000 people in Gaza have been killed, with more than 12,500 people injured. And just as I was preparing notes this morning, there was a bombing of Al-Ahli Hospital in Gaza, in what was considered a safe zone. We have to understand that there is no conflation between all Palestinians and a militant group that has been designated a terrorist organization like Hamas. And while Muslims globally support the right of all people to self-determination and freedom from colonization, Islam does not and has never condoned terrorism and the killing of innocent civilians. And so I feel this topic today is just so timely. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we progress. These quotes are all very touching and very difficult to read. But like I said, I wanted really to situate us in the now. We are facing an unprecedented moment, and our communities must work together. This student here says they were only in 7th grade when they were told to go back to their country and labeled an effing Afghan. And what I think is really telling in this quote is the student says, "I wish that we could stand up and show that we're not a bad religion. We don't teach violence, we teach tolerance." And then skipping ahead here, this student said, "I've just blocked that day out. All I can remember was walking down the hall and hearing a boy yell, 'The Muslims are going to be rounded up now.' The kids started snickering and chanting, 'Make America Great Again.' I didn't look up. I just ran and hid in the bathroom before anyone could see me cry. No one came to help me. No one told them to stop. No one did anything about it." And this idea of not feeling safe in our schools is really, I think, an important thing that we all aim to address today. Before I move on to talking a little bit about American Muslims as a group, I want to talk about, the incidence of discrimination that Muslims experience. And I'm taking a lot of this information from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. I have worked with this national research and education organization. They're based out of Washington, D.C. and Michigan since 2017. And every year, the Institute does a nationally representative survey of Muslims, Jews, Protestants, white evangelicals, Catholics, and non-affiliated Americans. And year after year, they have found that Muslims are the most likely group to report religious discrimination, followed, shortly thereafter by the Jewish community. So at a time when Muslims are also among the most demonized groups, it's very important that we know who American Muslims are. Muslims in the United States are often stereotyped and characterized as one ethnicity, as Arab, as perhaps Middle Eastern. But in fact, Muslims are the most ethnically diverse faith community in the United States. Again, this is data coming from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, showing that 1 in 4, 25% of Muslims in the United States identify as Black or African American. And I think that this is important to point out because the history of Black and African American Muslims has been largely erased in the United States. And although we often talk about Islam in the United States as the the product of immigration, or through the lens of immigration. The first critical mass of Muslims in the US came not as immigrants, but actually as enslaved Africans. 1.2 million Muslims were forcibly brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. And what that means is that the roots of Islam in the United States are actually older than the founding of the country itself. And I think that also is an important note. I did not mention, sort of where I'm speaking from today personally, but I'm at San Diego State University in San Diego, California. I serve as an undergraduate instructor here in addition to my doctoral work at UC San Diego. And I think it's important to realize that the roots of our country are based upon accumulation by dispossession of indigenous people and upon the enslavement and forced migration of people from Africa. And so, this land that I'm on is Kumeyaay land, and I think it's really important that we remember those roots and that we come to terms with that history as people in the United States. And I just have these two pictures here to represent a 2023 Pulitzer Prize winning opera that is bringing the history of Black and African American Muslims into the mainstream. This opera tells the story of Omar ibn Saad, who was an enslaved man in Charleston, South Carolina in the 19th century. In addition to that information, most Muslims in the United States are US citizens, which is something that often challenges stereotypes about Muslims being foreign or not belonging. And half of Americans in the US were actually born in the US. So again, important context when we're talking about inclusion in the national polity. Furthermore, Muslims are America's youngest faith community. And this bar graph shows the proportion of American Muslims who are aged 18 to 24 relative to other groups. An important thing I think that all of us need to understand is that Muslim youth are often on the front lines of bullying when it comes to Islamophobia, and they often have to really bear the brunt of negative media portrayals and bigoted political discourse. And so this student said, "I am proud of my religion, but that is a lot of pressure to try to present it and get everything right in front of everyone." So that brings me to, well, what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is defined as an exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility toward Islam and Muslims, perpetuated by negative stereotypes and resulting in bias, discrimination, and marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from American social, political, and civic life. It's also defined as a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. The roots of Islamophobia run very deep, and I could trace and talk about the history of Islamophobia all the way back to the 7th century. But I think that for the sake of time, I really wanted to bring us to the 17th to 19th century as a starting point to understand these roots, because it was at this time that Western Europe began a global expansion and sort of travel to lands that they hoped to colonize. And the Western Europe began to talk about the Orient, quote unquote, this vast geographical region that encompassed North Africa, the Middle East, Asia Minor, what we would talk about as East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Orient, as diverse as it was often spoken about in monolithic terms as a stand-in for Europe's other, a community that was deemed different, exotic, but also inferior. And much of my work builds on the work of Edward Said, who was an academic and critic, and he looked particularly at French and British discourse around the Orient. And he said that it constructed what he coined Orientalism. And Orientalism was a distorted view of the Orient that helped define Europe as its contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience. And knowledge I have here in quotes because it was knowledge that was very distorted, that was aimed at supporting domination, colonialism, and imperialism. And if you look at these two lists, these terms East and West have actually fallen out of favor. We often talk about the global North and the global South, but in Said's time, when he was writing in the late 1970s, he saw this pattern whereby the West was constructed in opposite terms of the East, civilized versus uncivilized, progressive versus traditional, dynamic versus static, logical and rational versus emotional and irrational, restrained versus prone to violence. And we see echoes of Orientalism all the way back to Napoleon's invasion of North Africa. This is a painting that has a lot of Orientalist themes. It portrays Napoleon Bonaparte in Jaffa, which is a city northwest of Jerusalem. And he almost is depicted in this Christ-like savior manner as he encounters the quote unquote, like the Arabs of this region. And this painting was actually made famous because it was a form of propaganda used by Napoleon to show, the leader, the rational leader coming in and saving this inferior group of people. We also see Orientalism in film as early as, as we had film. These two examples, the Sheikh and the Barbarian, both portrayed Muslims as foreign and exotic. But at this point in media representation, Muslims were not necessarily framed as threatening to US national security. That began to change in the 1970s onward, and we begin to see the depictions of Muslims as terrorists by default. And we see a range of scholarship that chronicles these negative and threatening portrayals of Muslims, all the way from this book by Edward Said called Covering Islam, through books written about the era before 9/11 and after 9/11, and as I have here, just recent publications as well in the last couple of years looking at negative media portrayals of Muslims. Muslims today are the most demonized group in US political and social discourse. And this is really, I think, made even more complicated by the fact that the majority of Americans say they do not know a Muslim. So for many of these Americans, what they know about Muslims, and it's the same in terms of what they know about any group that they have not come into contact with, comes from news and popular media representations. I think, again, the problem with this is that often those are biased and negative. Actually, content analysis of television media coverage of Islam and Muslims in the United States found that more than 80% of that coverage was negative. And a 25-year analysis of the New York Times showed that Islam was portrayed more negatively than cancer and cocaine. And you can just see here, some examples of popular media portrayals that involve Islam and Muslims as a monolith, as, all the same, by default prone to violence, by default terrorists, with a few exceptions here and there who are helping to root the terrorists out. In addition to that, when an individual plots a violent act, and says that they are inspired by Islam or that this is somehow justified in Islam, even though that goes against the tenets of Islam, that Muslim perceived perpetrator receives 770% more media coverage than a non-Muslim perceived perpetrator in an apples to apples comparison in terms of the level or degree of violence of the plot. Studies suggest that the association between the word terrorism and Muslims is so strong that even terrorism cues with no direct reference to Muslims can activate anti-Muslim stereotypes. And this is really where a lot of my personal research focuses. I look at how the resilience of racism and the resilience of Islamophobia actually stems not from a lack of facts. We have plenty of facts that would help dismantle these types of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, but that these things become so deeply rooted because of the way that they engage with us emotionally at the level of what theorists describe as affect, something that is, it's even pre-emotional. It's a pre-cognitive state that precedes emotion. And all of this negative emotion and affect around Muslims and their association with terrorism is deeply ironic because most American terrorist fatalities in the United States are not at the hands of anyone who claims to act in the name of Islam, but rather they are at the hands of right-wing terrorists. And law enforcement agencies have routinely ranked anti-government extremists as a greater threat than militants who purport to act in the name of Islam. The last sort of point I wanted to make was that for some people in the United States, Islamophobia has become very big business, with a total revenue capacity of at least $1.5 billion attributed to this Islamophobia industry in just 2 years between 2014 and 2016. And this industry takes the form of anti-Muslim pundits, bloggers, social media personalities, influencers who gain a following by rousing people up around anti-Muslim hate, and think groups that are perpetuating anti-Muslim stereotypes. And again, when we look at the facts, Muslims are actually the most likely faith group to reject military attacks on civilians, and the most likely group to reject individual attacks on civilians. And so, you know, the empirical data tells us that this is not at all what Islam condones, and these are not at all the attitudes of Muslims. This, I think, is the most important part of the presentation, and I'm trying to be mindful of time, and so I will go through this as quickly as possible. How can we address anti-Muslim bullying and Islamophobia? Well, we need to learn about it first. We cannot disavow and say that this isn't happening. Learn about its prevalence and incorporate identity-based bullying and discrimination into our organization's bullying policies. We need to explicitly mention protected groups and train our staff to recognize religious-based bullying. There are students who may not ask for help, but they may be struggling. And so recognizing the signs of students who might be struggling, whether it be in the form of anxiety and stress, acting out, self-harm, or a decrease in connection or decreased academic performance, school attendance, and connectedness. Part of the work that I do is talking about media portrayals of different groups and teaching critical media skills. I work with journalists. I've published guides to help journalists cover groups like Islam, like Muslims, and cover Islam more creatively and objectively. And we need to talk about those things with the youth with whom we work. We should also provide resources on Islam and Muslims to increase the cultural competency of teachers, students, and other parents, many of whom, again, have never met a Muslim. Educate staff and students on students' various cultural, racial, and religious identities, which can result in bullying experiences. You know, sometimes saying something as simple as no religion in the world condones terrorism and violence, but religion has been weaponized historically by various groups to justify their political aims. Something as simple as that takes the pressure off of students who know that their faith does not teach this, whose practice of their own faith with their parents and in their community is one of peace and tolerance. And so just saying that and not conflating, you know, one of the slides I skipped over, a teacher was described as pointing to the Middle East and saying, this is the region of peace haters. You know, we have to be able to address these moments and speak to them. Just to end, and I'm right at time, a couple of resources. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding has really fantastic research-based toolkits, educational materials, and other resources available at their website. And the Family and Youth Institute looks specifically at Muslim youth and has a wonderful bullying prevention toolkit and guide that I would highly, highly recommend. These are very difficult times. My father grew up with a Jewish neighbor and a Christian neighbor, and they were constantly sharing recipes. And there was a plate of food that was almost always being passed among the families. Here, try these cookies, try this bread we made. He has such fond memories of growing up in multi-religious communities in Egypt. And I just want to say that none of our religions inherently are antagonistic toward one another. We have to work together to support human rights and human dignity of all people, and put an end to, indiscriminate violence. It's just really horrific. So thank you all for your time today.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Father Joe Muth, and I'm a Catholic priest in Baltimore, Maryland. And I appreciate the other two speakers today presenting their information for us. Is very helpful. And it's really giving me hope, because it's one of the reasons why I continue to do this work, and I'm sure why these speakers and their organizations are doing the work that they do too. One of the things we do with our youth in our parish is that every summer we take several local trips. We'll take a van full of teenagers and we'll go to a synagogue, and we'll go to a mosque, and we'll go to a Hindu temple. They're local here in Baltimore. And we call ahead of time, and we meet with the leaders of the mosque, the synagogue, or the temple, and have them meet with our youth and begin a conversation about what they believe, who they are, what their information is, and trying to help the students from our parish understand people from different faith experiences. And the reason we do that is because what has already kind of been said already, that some of the depiction that young people get of Jews and Muslims and Hindus is from the television or from games, and we want them to meet real people and see real buildings and be in real circumstances, so they can meet people. So when they see something depicted on the television or on some game board, that they'll be able to say, well, that's not what happened when we met somebody. They were nice, or they were kind, or they helped us, or they talked to us. And we give them a different perspective than what they might normally see on the television or in some other media. So we try to make that a prominent part of our summertime when we take the youth to some of these different religious institutions. And then, of course, in the same way, we develop relationships. And that's one of the important things that we do. We see this interfaith connection as really a relationship development process, helping our young people to develop relationships with people of another faith and people of another tradition or people of another background, that they begin to see the normalcy of humanity and the difference of humanity from our different religious traditions, but the normalcy of humanity in the way that we see life. And so some of our young people are able to kind of connect with each other along the way. Even when we've done that before, we've been able to help our young people see what the development is of relationships. We also work with an organization in Baltimore called ICJS, which is the Islamic Christian Jewish Study Group. And we meet with pastors and rabbis and imams, religious leaders, and share our own religious studies and our own histories with each other. And it's a great organization. It helps us to kind of listen to each other from our different perspectives and how we understand what goes on in the world and how we come together, like what's happening now in the Middle East. The ICJS calls us together, and we have conversations about what's going on and how we understand it and what it is we're called to respond to in our own congregations. And so it's a great way for us to kind of understand what's happening in somebody else's world and understanding how something is happening in our world. It's a great a gift that we give to each other in that way. And as you might, the relationship building is so important. In March 15, 2019, when the Christ Church, New Zealand was mosque was shot up, in the Al Noor Mosque in the Linwood Islamic Center. There were 51 people killed and 40 were injured. At that day, that following Sunday, I got up in our church and I announced that because of that shooting, we need to go to a mosque and visit with people to stand in solidarity with them. So the following Friday, 40 people from our Catholic church carpooled to the local mosque near us, and we spent some time with them in prayer on their regular Friday Jummah prayer. So then, unbelievable, about a month later, on April 21st, 2019, it was Easter Sunday, some terrorists shot up some Catholic churches in Sri Lanka. And unbeknownst to us, the following Sunday, 20 people from the mosque showed up at our Catholic church and said, "You came and visited us when our churches were attacked in New Zealand. We would like to come and visit with you today." So they came to us on a Sunday and they said, "We have no idea how you pray and what your Sunday service is about, but we'd like to be with you." So they came in and we introduced them to the whole congregation, and they sat with us during our prayer service to be a part of what our prayer was together that day. So it's an important part of relationship building that we reach out beyond what our normal boundaries usually keep us behind. We have to go beyond our boundaries, the boundaries of us as a Catholic Church. We have to go beyond those boundaries to say there are other people out there that are hurting and facing discrimination or bullying or fear, and we have to go and stand with them because it's an important part of our relationship building in our religious tradition and in our city. And at the same time, when we've done some of those visits, some of the parents of our church have told us, "We're so glad you're doing this. We're so glad because we want our children to learn about mosques and synagogues and temples. We don't want them to grow up not knowing that." And so they always bring their children along, their teenagers along, to see and learn and experience what other people have encountered along the way. And it's a great way of developing a broader perspective of religious understanding, not just Catholic religious understanding, but a broader perspective of religious understanding that we can share with each other and learn from each other. Because what the children see on, like I said, on television or media doesn't always give them the true story. And we like to be able to give them the true story. We got together, we have a Catholic school on our property known as Cardinal Sheehan School. And we talked in our church about getting connected to the Muslim community. And so our Catholic school met with the Al Rahma school, a Muslim school in the other side of town. And we had our teachers come together to see how we could work with our students and have them get to know each other. And one of the things that we did was we talked about how we could do that. Pope Francis wrote an encyclical on how to care for the earth and how to care for the poor. And when we were talking with the Muslim teachers, with the Catholic teachers, we said, "How are we going to get our students from both of our schools to come together?" And one of the Catholic teachers said, "Well, why don't we use the Pope's most recent document on care for the poor and care for the earth?" And the Muslim teachers all said, "That's a great idea. We read that document." I said, "You read the Pope's document?" They said, "Yes, we love that document. That's really important for us." So we came together over that document, Care for the Poor and Care for the Earth. And on one instance, we went to the Al Rahma school with our students and the Muslim students, and we made sandwiches for the local soup kitchen. And the Muslim students all said to the Catholic students, "Now don't seal the sandwich bag." So they all had to put messages in the sandwich bag, messages that said, "I love you, I hope you're going to be safe tonight." And we would give those sandwiches out to the homeless. So some of the leaders from both groups took them down to the local soup kitchen the next day. So we really work on having our youth be involved in some of these activities because it's a great way for us to connect them again to a world beyond their world. And about a month later at the church that I'm at, St. Matthew, we had a gathering about the visit to the Muslim school. We had a Catholic girl and a Muslim girl. We asked them to get up and tell what their experience was like. And they both got up and said, "Well, initially we were a little afraid to get to know each other because we didn't know what she was like." And then the Muslim girl said, "But you know what? I found out that she likes basketball." And the Catholic girl said, "And I found out that we both listen to the same rappers." So all of a sudden, the distance that being Muslim and Catholic brings to people, all of a sudden it falls apart and you have kids being kids. and you have teenagers being teenagers, and you have them talking to each other and getting to know each other beyond what they would normally do. So being able to do those kind of things has really been an important part of our work. And we also had people in the church from 45 different countries, and that's why we started our immigration center. And so at our immigration center, we always told people that when you come here, this is a safe place. You can tell your story any way you want to tell your story. We will help you get through whatever you're facing. And as Stephanie mentioned, we also had a gay and lesbian outreach group in our church. We would tell people the same thing. This is a safe place. You can tell your story any way you'd like, and we will help you get through whatever your struggles may be. So these kind of opportunities we've taken advantage of. Now, I work with a local community organization called BUILD, B-U-I-L-D, and BUILD has a violence interruption committee, and I'm on the violence interruption committee. And the violence interruption committee goes around to elementary schools, Catholic elementary schools, and public elementary schools. And we had in our own city about all the violence, and we know about the violence, but we also discovered that the politicians talk about the violence, pastors talk about the violence, but we haven't heard the kids talk about the violence. So we would take a violence interruption committee around to the elementary schools and ask the youth about the violence, what they think, how they heard, how they experience it. And some of the things they said were, we asked them, why is there violence? And some of the youth said, the city has a minority population, therefore others don't take the violence seriously. They also said some police officers are abusive. Some people don't watch the news and are not informed. And some parents have to teach their children how to act with the police. Now, some of you probably know that African-American parents have to teach their young teenage men caution when they're driving and they get stopped by the police. And we've talked about that in church with our families and helping the young people to recognize the necessity of that. But one of the interesting things in our church, we also have a number of African families. And some of the African parents came to me and said, we're so glad we're not in the African-American community because they have to tell their children about being stopped by the police, and we don't because we're African. I said, no, don't think that way, because the police don't ask whether you're African-American or African. The police just see that you're Black, and that's why you get stopped. And so we had to do a whole kind of education for parents, some of the African parents around that issue, so they'd be able to address the issue with their children if they were old enough to drive or were getting stopped by the police. So we've had some positive aspects in trying to address some of these current issues in our world and trying to make sure our youth know that, and our youth are facing up to the issues that they need to face, along with helping the parents to do that too. So when we work with the youth and work with the parents, we find that there's a positive respect and a positive outcome that comes from that, and it's an important part of our way of dealing with our communities. So through that, it's been an opportune time for us to kind of learn from the youth and have them teach us and have us teach them about how this whole experience takes place. So I'm really appreciative of the work that's been going on that I've heard about today from Ms. Abdallah and Mr. Eaton, and I'm glad that in my place that I'm even distant from you, that we have a common closeness of intimacy on the work that we do. Even though we are at a distance, we are doing a common ground work, and I'm very grateful for that. And thank you for your presentations today.